So, for the most part, I call it secrets on display because there's a change in the early 16th century that we can sort of pin down to a couple of points where the fencing comes from something like Chittister was talking about, how it's meant to be secret, it's meant to be for an elite few, it's meant to be knowledge that you have to transmit personally, right? You have to have an instructor to explain what these things mean, or you have to have access to a gloss. And then it changes. Eventually we get things like the fechtschule, which was not something that was invented in the 16th century, but it underwent a huge character change. They became highly public events, and they became highly public ways for men to demonstrate, men and some women sometimes too, but for the most part men, to demonstrate sort of their value as citizens to wherever they live. So citizenship is a really big part of what makes this kind of fencing important, and what makes this kind of fencing something that Meyer never refers to it directly, but it's heavily implied that a lot of what he's teaching, especially in his longsword and bissac sections, is meant for this context, right? So when we're talking about a fechtschule, we mostly mean it could be a public or a private event, and it would involve a fechtmeister, and it would involve a bunch of students or other fencers who would come in and they would publicly compete to hit each other on the head with swords and to score bleeding wounds against their opponents. And the people who did that would win money. So, starting in the early 16th century, there are huge kind of sweeping social changes that are going on. We call them the Reformation or the Reformations. It's mostly this guy's fault, Martin Luther, although he was not the first dissenter against the Catholic Church, and he was definitely not the last. He was the one where we kind of mark the beginning of the Reformation properly, right? A lot of this had to do with the sort of popularity and dissemination of printing presses, which made access to knowledge easier, right? So we go from what Chittister was talking about, those manuscripts that are handwritten, they're written down by scribes, they're highly expensive, they're extremely sort of densely made, long-lasting things, to cheaper books that are accessible, that people can literally just sell, you can go buy, you can print things, all kinds of ways. So shortly after sort of the printing press and the Reformation's going on, we have two things that I think kind of set the stage for the kind of mentality that you might have as a burgher, as a citizen, right? You're of the middling classes. You might be extremely wealthy, but you're not noble. You might also be dirt poor, but you're not a peasant, right? You're sort of an urban, I hesitate to use the word middle class because it doesn't really jive with what we know, but they're part of the burgher class, right? These are artisans, craftsmen, tradesmen, merchants, bankers, all the kind of people that do commerce, the way that we understand commerce, and are not actually part of what we call the three estates, right? So this sort of medieval model of society is up at the top. You have basically the noblemen and the clergy, those who fight and those who pray, and then at the bottom you have those who work, right? And this is a very, very neat little model that probably never actually existed in reality, but that's the way they thought of society at the time. Because you have the peasants, they work, you have the knights, they fight, and you have the clergy, and they pray. And the clergy pray for everybody, right? That's their job. They pray for the souls of every living human being, ideally. The knights fight for every living human being, ideally. And those who work and produce food, generally, for every other person. And then you have the burghers who kind of show up and are like, where do we fit? Because a lot of them are richer than the knights. Some of them are more holy than, the clergy, and they work harder than the peasantry, right? So they don't really fit in this model. So in the 1520s, we have kind of two conflicts in the Holy Roman Empire that I think kind of really get at this idea that the burghers are kind of starting to think of themselves as kind of a privileged, sort of a special class of people, is we have the German Knights Revolt. And in short, the German Knights Revolt was the Holy Roman Empire decided to outlaw a specific type of feuding that involved knights literally raiding each other and attacking each other and killing each other, usually not, but killing their peasants at the very least, and kidnapping their cousins and things like that, and holding them for ransom or demanding satisfaction of some grievance or other. And the Holy Roman Empire said, all right, that's enough. It's illegal. And then I said, well, no, it isn't. And they had a revolt. It was a very short-lived revolt, and it didn't work very well, because the Holy Roman Empire said, well, they hired a bunch of mercenaries who came in and kicked the crap out of the knights. And so this guy is Franz von Sickingen, who was one of the leaders of the German Knights Revolt. Just a year after, we have the German Peasants' War, or the Great Peasant Revolt is sometimes what it's called. And this was an absolutely enormous popular uprising that lasted a summer or two, that involved hundreds of thousands of peasants around Germany rebelling against more or less the Catholic Church, but there were sects of this. Very popular trends among the German peasants that were basically anarchists, right? They were looking to flip out the world order and flatten it completely. So we have this very early kind of communism coming in, and Friedrich Engels is actually a guy who's written one of the more kind of comprehensive histories of the German Peasants' War, unsurprisingly, because he saw it as, again, this sort of proto-communist uprising. In any case, it's the largest popular uprising in Europe prior to the French Revolution, right? So this is an absolutely enormous thing. So again, if you're, in 1526, after all this stuff goes down, and you're just like a shoemaker in Hamburg or something like that, and you think, well, the knights are insane because all they want to do is like go and kill each other for ransom, and the peasants want to just eradicate every single thing in the world and like topple the world order. They're insane. The only actual sane people on earth are us, the burghers, right? Because we can do all the things that everybody else does, but better. It's kind of the idea they're getting at, right? Whether or not we have to believe that is a totally different thing, but that kind of fits into the mentality of the way that sort of burghers think about themselves, and that affects the way that they fence. It affects the way that they train in fencing. A little bit about Andre Parnfeint. So he's the guy that I think is more or less responsible for this change between private and public, or elite and sort of disseminated fencing knowledge. He wrote a book in 1516 that was published that had 12 rules for beginning fencers. And 12 rules for beginning fencers were basically he took the Zettel, the Lichtenauer Zettel, and broke it down into 12 basic concepts and basic rules. And it was meant to be easy and digestible and accessible. He was a Trabant, or a bodyguard. And these were guys who, they didn't just like sit in papal palaces and like stand by the doors and cross their halberds before, the main character comes in. They were guys on battlefields who like used halberds to like kill people. And there were cardinals who were battlefield commanders during the Reformation and in various wars and things that lit off on there. So they meant business, right? And you see both these guys have halberds, which was sort of a distinctive part about, again, being a cardinal's guard. Halberds, even by the early 16th century, weren't necessarily battlefield tools anymore. People were using pikes. But the halberd actually stayed important for a number of different reasons that I don't have really the time to go into, but I'd love to talk about. Anyway, it's the first printed fecht book, right? So it's the first one that, again, it's meant to be disseminated. It's meant to be accessible to anyone who wants it. And he's aiming it primarily at, again, these sort of cardinal guardsmen and people who maybe have never fenced before. But that kind of trend gets picked up by other burghers who probably have fenced before, and they probably have martial knowledge in the scope of wrestling and things like that, but they might not necessarily be artful fencers, right? So having access to something like Parnfeint's book would make a big change, because now you have access to the secret information that will transform you from just your average fencer to an artful or crafty fencer of public skill and renown, right? He also called himself a Frye Factor, and this is pretty important because Frye Factor comes to be pretty important, especially in relation to these guys, the Brotherhood of St Mark. So we all know the Marksbrüder. So this is the Marksbrüder, right? They call themselves the Brotherhood of St Mark. This is sort of the symbol of St Mark here, the winged lion. And if you saw Roger's presentation the other night, you see this crop up all the time, and especially you see this sort of thing being sort of ritually put down in Meyer's art and in all sorts of other kind of Frye Factor facing things. It's like you have the cat licking itself and that kind of thing, right? Representing these guys, the kitties. They receive their papal privilege, or not papal, their sort of privilege as to form themselves as a guild or have the privileges of a guild in 1487 by Friedrich III, who's this guy here, who's the Holy Roman Empire at the time. And they were mostly associated with the Furriers Guild out of Frankfurt. And Furriers Guild, that comparison stayed there for quite a long time. We actually have a poem that was written by a guy who he set up shop as a printer or something like that. He had a sign that he hung outside his door that basically said, like the Frye Factors and all good burghers are friends, and all the Furriers and the Brotherhood of St Mark are enemies. And the Marksbrüder complained until that sign was brought down. Yeah, Roger.
Just adding the anecdotes I mentioned before about Heinrich Agrippa, the Frye Factor,
yeah,
could throw a spell.
Right.
The story is that there is a group of furriers that he scares away because they're so scared about him throwing a spell that would devour the souls.
Right.
It's a good story.
So the big part here is that there's sort of the privilege that they got from the Empire gave them the ability to make masters of the longsword. They were technically the only organization that was allowed to bestow the rank of master on a fencer, right? So we also have, there's some very small indication that I don't think is actually true, that you'd have to basically test with the Marksbrüder, you'd have to be a master of the Marksbrüder to be a Doppelsoldner, right, a double pay soldier. I don't think that's true. You know, mercenary companies were private organizations that could run however they wanted. So if you thought there was a guy who was pretty good at whatever, you could pay him double, and you didn't have to report that to anyone at all, right? Anyway, this is all just to say that even in a military context, like the longsword still stays useful. Even if it's highly symbolic, even if it's not something that every soldier is going to have or resort to on the battlefield, having it and being able to wield it is highly symbolic in a military context as well as a civic context. So outside the Brotherhood of St. Mark, you still have a lot of people who fence, and they call themselves Frye Factor for the most part. So we don't know 100% whether or not they are unaffiliated with the Marksbrüder, because the Marksbrüder also had a journeyman rank called Frye Factor. So there are some times when somebody self-identifies as a Frye Factor, that might mean that they're just like going around doing their journeyman fencing as a Marksbrüder, hoping to become a master, a recognized master within the guild. But for the most part, it tends to be fairly clear when they don't mean that, because they're usually, you know, having sort of poems and rhymes and things where they're slamming the Marksbrüder and saying, like, you know, what a bunch of jerks they are, that kind of thing. I thought this was pretty fun. This is actually titled something like the Frye Factors on the March or something like that. You can see them carrying flails, which we pointed out in the staff section in Meyer. You see the kids with the flails. It might be symbolic of the fact that they still view themselves as some people who work, right? They produce useful things for society, symbolized again by the threshers and whatnot. And there's probably something that was supposed to be here that hadn't been filled in. And anyway, look at how fly they look.
Go to all the max.
Okay.
There are fences with feathers,
yeah,
staffs, and a number of different weapons.
Okay. Yeah. So we also have the indication that the printing culture, the early printing culture in the 16th century, they have this thing they called Zunftfrei. They wanted to remain guild-free, right? So Zunft is the German word for guild. And there's this indication throughout all this that the Frye Factor are these guys who are kind of cantankerous and don't want to be affiliated with the Marksbrüder. They don't think that the art of fencing is something that should be controlled through a guild, right? Just like printers don't think that the access to the written word should be a privilege. It should be something that's available to everybody. So there's this very, very, very strong trend, especially in Basel, which is where papermaking guilds work and all sorts of other things, to keep printing Zunftfrei, right? And I think that's kind of what's going on with the Frye Factors. They have the same kind of idea that, right, we see it in every source. They call sword fighting an art. They call it a craft. It's very, very important for their kind of self-identity to see this and to suddenly, you know, this big, huge change, to keep it something that's public and accessible, because everybody should be able to do this and sort of prove their masculinity and usefulness as a citizen through the art of fencing. So there's some commonalities between the Marksbrüder and the Frye Factor, and just really quickly, most of the time if you see indications of soldiers, or sometimes they'll call them Marksbrüder, sometimes they'll call them Frye Factor, sometimes they'll call them Landsknechts or whatever, you typically see they're usually carrying a polearm and they have a sword of some kind. This is obviously a very large sword with a pretty interesting complex hilt, and you know, a pike probably on his shoulder. And most of the time when you see depictions of soldiers or people who are depicted as soldiers or guardsmen or something, they usually have they have a sword and they have a polearm. And this is on purpose, right? Because in order to be a useful soldier, you have to be useful in different contexts, right? Soldiers in the 16th century, you didn't like go up to a recruiter and say, I'm going to sign up and it's okay, you've got a contract for 5 years or whatever. Very often if you're a male in the 16th century who needs to, you know, you might be a soldier for a year or two and then go back home and just live the rest of your life, right? It wasn't uncommon. Being a soldier is less of a distinction as we think about it today and more of a circumstance, right? So there are quite a lot of men in the 16th century would have had an opportunity to arm themselves and serve in the capacity of soldiers, even if they didn't think of themselves as a soldier. And this gets a lot more clear when we see kind of the civic context of militias, serving as a guardsman, serving as a fire watchman, serving as, you know, a gate guard or a tower guard or something like that. That was every single citizen's responsibility to either do that or furnish a replacement who would do it in your stead, right? And more we start seeing people that are willing to pay a guy to do it in their stead. That's fairly common all the time anyway. But this feeds into the idea that we kind of see at play symbolically in fechtschule, right? But the commonalities between the Frye Factor and the Marksbrüder, right? Both groups have the Zettel, they have access to it, and they expand it in certain ways. Both groups have more or less pared down the weapons that were available in the early kind of German sources, right? They had, you know, wrestling, dagger, polearm, mounted in harness and without harness and all this other stuff. They pare it basically down to 3 weapons. They've got a sword in one hand, a weapon in 2 hands, a sword in 2 hands, and some sort of staff weapon, right? So Parnfein teaches longsword. He's the first source that we know of to call it a Dussack, and the staff. And he actually says, like, the longsword teaches you how to use the Schlagschwert, you know, these huge battlefield swords. He even talks about it being, what do you call the one sword that has the dull part you use for stabbing? What's that?
Zweihander.
Well, not the Zweihander. It's the specific one that used. It's literally like you've got the sharp blade, and then it has like a articulation point, and it's got a point.
Not the Estock.
It's the Estock, yeah. He actually mentions an Estock. Yeah, as like Parnfein's useful. Like you can use this system for an Estock as well,
Right.
which then he doesn't teach any thrusts. It's all cuts. So who knows? Anyway, that's the idea. And the Marksbrüder and the Frye Factor both often exclude the armored and mounted sections. It's not always true, but they do. And we know that Meyer even had access to a thing and was probably writing something about harness and mounted as well, which would have made sense if he's going to train, you know, the Duke of Mecklenburg's or you know the Emperor's troops. They're going to have to know how to do that stuff too. But all these weapons are useful in multiple contexts, right? So battlefield is one context, and the civic context is another one, and it's more important for what we want to talk about. So when we're looking at kind of the civic context of violence or urban violence, there are generally 3 things that we're talking about, right? We've got duels. We're fairly familiar with those, at least in sort of the broad aesthetic strokes. We've got brawls. I'm going to go back so you can see this picture a little bit better, right? I love this thing. This isn't from the 16th century, it's from a little bit later, but like, you got this crying kid over here, right? You've got the distraught wife trying to pull her drunk husband off this guy. You got this dude who's trying to brain a guy with a jug, right? There's the barking dog, there's just like a shoe right there, right? Like, this is like, it's messy. This is Meyer, you know, constantly, well, not constantly, but he mentions a mindless peasant's brawl, right? It's disparaging. Brawling is something that is unfit for proper, you know, honorable burghers. It's unfit for people of culture and class. It's not something you want to get into all the time. If you're going to fight, you're going to do it either in a duel, which was illegal most of the time, but it was viewed as legitimate, and there's tension there, but it's legitimate. It's a legitimate way to settle your issues. If you kill the other guy, you're still a murderer, right? But that was viewed as a legitimate kind of threat and a legitimate response to go out. And we'll talk a bit about that in a second. And then we have fechtschule, right? And fechtschule at first, we tend not to think of them in the same category of the other things, right? Because we tend, as modern people, to see this huge demarcation between earnest fencing, deadly, on the street, real deadly longsword fencing, and then we see something like fechtschule, which is play fighting. It's sport, right? And my argument, more or less, here is that because of reasons we'll get into in just a moment, there's not that big a difference between any of these things, right? A fechtschule that goes bad has the potential to devolve into a brawl. Brawls have the potential to devolve into riots and pogroms and nasty, nasty urban street fighting. Duels have the same capacity, right? And the fechtschule and the duel are both ways to make tension or make parts of the community avoid things like reckless fighting, like brawling, and sort of counter to civic virtue ideas of other types of urban violence, right? Because if you have a culture of honor and you have a culture of armed men, especially armed young men, they're going to fight. There's no way to stop that. And this was viewed as sort of legitimate or illegitimate ways of using that sort of ability to be armed and to defend your honor and your life and all that. So up first, we have duels, right? We're all fairly familiar with duels. So the first thing to understand about dueling in this context. Now, dueling is fairly omnipresent throughout, again, any sort of armed culture. We have some form of dueling. And it could get crazy, like, you know, everybody's heard of like Russian roulette. That's a duel, right? And that's a way to ritualize violence and to ritualize fights between two people in a way that won't devolve into burning each other's houses down or lighting an entire city on fire, right? So in the 16th century, at the very least, they followed this very standard kind of pattern of escalation, right? Me and somebody else in the bar have words. The other guy says, hey, take that back. I say, make me, right? I refuse to apologize. I think that he should apologize to me. And we're doing this in front of an audience, right? You're almost never going to have a duel between two dudes who are alone, because you do it for the audience, right? It's like a wedding. You don't. If you're getting married, the marriage is great. The wedding's for everyone else. It's not for you, right? You don't get to enjoy that day. It's for everybody else. And the duel is the same sort of thing, right? The dueling is showing everybody else your willingness to die for something ephemeral, right? Is your willingness to die for something like your honor, or to defend your household, or to defend your guild, or to defend your city, and to defend the honor of all of those things, right? So it gets, there's, one of the best examples that I have of this comes from Tlusty's work, so the martial ethic of early modern Germany, right? She describes a story of these two dudes, both of whom are named Casper, at a bar owned by a guy named Casper, right? So there's Casper number 1 and Casper number 2. Casper number 1 insults Casper number 2, who at first just seems to be like, down with it, he's fine, right? And Casper number 1's getting really angry because he wants to provoke this guy into a fight, and he's just not taking it. And he gets up and he storms out and he says he's going home to get his sword. And this is in the depositions that we have of what happened after, right? It's written down in this very kind of vague way. It's like he went into the baking hut and called for his sword, right? Which tells us actually quite a lot. Like he wasn't wearing his sword at the time, but he had access to it, so he went home to get it. And his wife said, "Please, for the love of God, don't fight." And he threatened to hit her, right? And he made the servant go get his sword for him. So he comes back, and he's presumably out in the street waiting for Casper number 2, who's just sort of sitting there. And in the meantime, one of they described as a youth in the bar is just sitting there, right? And he looks at the other Casper or mentions to somebody else, you know. The insult that predicated this whole thing, by the way, is Casper number 1 called Casper number 2, sort of the fighting words of the 16th century. He called him a dog's cunt, right? And this was like the particular insult that you can't. It's like calling somebody in like the old West like yellow bellied, right? You're a coward, and that means you got to fight, right? So he called him a dog's cunt, and Casper number 2 is just like, whatever, man, get out of here. And this youth is sitting there, sort of watching this whole thing. He's like, somebody called me a dog's cunt, I'd smack him upside the head, right? And so this is sort of symbolizing this idea that it's, again, there's this audience here that expects certain behaviors. And if Casper number 2 doesn't get up and go out and fight, then people might start thinking, well, maybe he is a coward. Maybe he is a dog's cunt. You know, how is he not defending himself against something like that? And he ends up going out into the street, and they have a fight, and Casper number 1, the instigator of the whole thing, ends up dying. Casper number 2 tries to run away because he realizes, oh God, I've killed this guy. And he tries to get out of the city, and he gets arrested, right? And luckily for him, he actually has people in his corner pulling for him, and they write letters to the magistrate saying that he's generally a very honorable guy who's provoked into this thing, and there's this youth, right, who escalated the thing. And so they went through this whole thing, and eventually, rather than being hanged as a murderer, he was only exiled for a year, which is a better way, right? But that still means he's cut off from his guild, he's cut off from his citizenship, he's cut off from his home, and he's cut off from his home city for an entire year. So hopefully he's got relatives somewhere else he can go crash for a while before he's allowed legally to come back into the city. Otherwise he exists outside the legal structure, which is bad. You don't want that, right? So more or less what I'm trying to get across is that the idea of the duel that we have, that you're going to get two dudes with naked sharps and they're going to hammer at each other until one of them dies, is actually very rare. It's a fairly rare occurrence. Duels are about showing your ability and your willingness to injure yourself heinously or die in defense of your honor or defense of your household or city or anything like that, right? Another really fun anecdote we have actually from 1628, there's a guy named Stephen Carl Behem. And Stephen Carl Behem was kind of a black sheep his entire life, and he was a military courier for a little while. during the 30 Years' War. He had an altercation with another officer. It ended up in a fight, and after he killed this guy in a duel, he wrote to his guardian saying, well, I can prove to you that I didn't intend to kill him because I hit him with the short edge of my sword, right? Which doesn't necessarily tell us that Stephen Carl is telling the truth, right? That he didn't intend to kill the guy or that he hit him in just a way to prevent killing him or whatever. But it tells us that at least he thought his guardian would see the argument that I hit him with the short edge of my sword as proof that he was trying to avoid killing him, right? Because the duel, again, isn't about killing the guy. It's not this sort of two men enter the ring and one guy dies, right? This sort of idea that we have of dueling is constantly always deadly. There's always more attached to it. There's more context that's going on between these two guys who are trying to hammer out their differences. And they're doing it, for the most part, unwillingly. Because like you're getting pressured into it because everybody else around you is watching what you're doing, right? And that's really important in our understanding of this sort of kaleidoscope of violence that's going on in the 16th century, right? And lastly, duels are meant to be fair, right? They're structured specifically so that they are fair fights. Because if they're unfair, well, that's going to make this dude's friends suddenly get up and they're going to start pulling their swords out, or they're going to start, insulting the other guys, or they're going to start doing other things that might lead to bigger acts of violence, right? So it was actually, there were legal penalties for doing things like laying your right hand on your sword, right? This was illegal. So if me and Roger are having words here, and I have my hand resting on my sword here, this isn't really a threat. If on the other hand I start doing this could be actually viewed as a threat. And if anything happens, if Roger trips home and falls down the stairs on his way home, and everybody says, well, you know what, Adam was really threatening him in the bar that night, right? That could lead to trouble. If I pull my sword out an inch, I've legally attacked him. In some legal codes in the 16th century, right? As much as an inch of steel showing in my sword, I have committed assault. There's also a rule that says that if I go up and strike your house with my sword, or the door of your house with my sword, that I've legally attacked you, right? I've committed assault on your person, right? Up to and sometimes including attempted murder for striking the door of your house with my sword. There's legal codes of not striking sparks on the street with your sword, right? Which means that people were doing that, right? So all this stuff is like, it's not like this comes out of nowhere, or you have this idea of like people just kind of going at each other and killing each other. It's all this kind of recognized, clear social signaling that leads to what we know of as a sort of formal duel, right? And these sort of things are common throughout all dueling systems, but they change, obviously, to different cultural contexts and different sort of patterns of behavior as they go out. But generally, this kind of recognizable pattern of escalation is part of dueling everywhere, all over the place. So up next, we've got Brawls, which, here's that awesome thing again, slightly bigger, right? And there's another one, right, of this dude. We don't know what he's got up here, but he's about to brain this poor guy. And, we can see it's associated with peasants, right? Meyer calls them peasant brawls, men of low character. It's associated, obviously, with drunkenness. Lots of improvised weaponry, like this clay jug here. And this is something that's like, it's untempered violence, is what it is, right? It's violence that's unrestrained. Because dueling is violent, but at least it's restrained. It's filtered through this kind of cultural code that we all recognize. Whereas a brawl is a mess. It's a bunch of people just slugging it out, with no point or purpose, regardless of the consequences. And that's bad if you live in a small city of very flammable houses and things like that, right? You don't want brawls to happen, because brawls, again, will involve whole groups of people. It might spill out onto the streets. You might get the guardsmen involved. You might get relatives involved. You might get, most of the people who lived in early modern cities, who were members of guilds, lived essentially in the same areas as the rest of their sort of trade kin, I guess. All the people that they work with live on the same streets in the same quarters. So if you're at like a tavern that's maybe between the cutlers and the paper makers, and they're at it hammer and tongs, well, it's somebody can peek out a window and be like, oh, they're fighting, and he's going to grab his sword and run out and go help. And pretty soon you've got an entire city, with their swords drawn, going around killing each other, right? And I'm like, it seems silly, but this is an absolute risk. This is something that happens, especially during the Reformation, where not only is there tension between two guilds that might be rivals, or two people that might be rivals, or feuds that were still going on even though they were technically illegal, like that ever changed anything. You still have all these things that have the potential to spill out from a personal feud or a personal problem between two more or less consenting individuals into something that actually threatens the safety of the entire city, right? And once you start throwing in religion into the mix, now we've got Catholics against Protestants, against other Protestants, against different other sects of Protestants, right? So there's indications that Meyer may have been a Calvinist. Calvinists didn't always get along with other Protestant sects, right? Jews lived in most of these cities all the time and were commonly targets of riots and pogroms, and people would get pissed off and not be able to do what they wanted to the people they wanted to do it to, so they went down to the Jewish quarter and burned it down. This happened, right? And this was viewed as something that was not good. Like, they knew it happened, but saying that it was something that people liked or wanted to happen all the time is nonsense, right? So the idea of this brawl, while it might look funny, and right, while this sort of rhetoric of the women trying to pull their husbands off of this has a really, like, an extremely important civic character to it, because it's all of our responsibility collectively as citizens to make sure this doesn't happen. And if what we have to do is push our friends into having a duel, because that's going to settle things right now, rather than devolve into a feud that might, involve a burnt quarter of the city, then that's our job too, right? It's also technically our job to stop the duel, but that was one of those things that, again, it's illegal versus illegitimate versus legitimate. It's complicated, right? So riotous behavior involving whole groups and whatnot, and they're definitely not fair, right? This is something that is the de-evolution of these cultural rituals of violence that lead to these kind of big, huge, nasty problems that they have in the city. So how do we tie all that stuff into fechtschule, right? Because we tend not to think of these things as, like, we almost don't think of them as violent, really, right? It's almost, we view it as a sport. And I was talking to Chris earlier today, right? And there are some sports, or at least activities that were pursued for fun in the early modern period that involved, like, taking a cat and nailing it to a tree and then betting on people to go and try to bite the cat without getting scratched. They view that as a sport, right? This is something we'd send somebody to prison for today, and they called it a sport. So, right, what does that tell us about how people in the 16th century viewed sport? Because this is definitely a sport, but it's not a sport in the way that we think of sports, as these sort of very fair competitions. Everything's sort of, you're in there to demonstrate your skill in the game and everything, but what we really see when we think of sports are like, how well can you game the rules so that you win when everything else is equal, right? And that's kind of the culture that we have, is that you'll see people watching a football game and they'll get pissed off because the coach didn't do a thing that, he didn't challenge a certain thing because of the weird metagame that's going on in that, right? They didn't really think about sporting events that way. They didn't think about fairness that way. They didn't think about competition that way. So fechtschule were often included in huge public festivals, right? And so, like, this image here is a really big one, or at least indicating kind of a really big one. And sort of the more we look at this, the sort of weirder it seems, right? Because, like, what's going on with this guy? Right? What's that? Is he being attacked by snakes? What's going on? So he's got, like, streamers on, right? And he's probably like a Pritzmeister or some sort of fool or comical person that's in there. We've got this guy ready to hurl a stone. So we this weekend have done a couple of warm-up games that involve basically being in this posture, right? And hurling the stone as far as we can. We've got drummers and musicians. We've got guys on horses that look like they're jousting. We've got dudes with pikes. And we've got various fechtmeister out here with their staffs, or Schutzhalter at the very least, with their staffs, overwatching everything. We've got the long sword, we've got the Dussax, we've got the staff weapons and the pikes, and all the sort of recognizable hallmarks of the fechtschule, right? So fechtschule were different everywhere, right? There was never a single document that said this is how every single fechtschule is going to be. Even the ones from Prague that have been going around Facebook all the time, like the 32 rules or whatever, are probably the most comprehensive that we have of any kind of individual assessment of a fechtschule. A lot of them are like 4 or 5 rules, right? And we all know them because we're all Meyer people, right? No thrusting. You can only target the head. No use of the pommel. No grappling. No striking above or below the staff, right? Those are basically the rules that we all know. Some of them don't write that stuff down. Some of them have some of the rules and they don't write it down. Other times they do write them down, presumably because maybe there are people coming from different quarters of the city who haven't participated before who need to know that you don't use the point. But ideally everybody already knows. Everybody shows up at a fechtschule. You know what the rules are. And you know that breaking the rules comes with certain consequences. And right, what happens if you break a rule today in, like, basketball? Well, there's a foul and there's a certain sort of regimented punishment for it that is supposed to give an advantage to the other team. What happens if you're fighting a guy in effectual and he's got his arms up over his head, right? Meyer tells you a couple ways to hit him out of that. He also tells you sometimes just to wail on his arms until he stops, right? Right? And so kind of what we approach is this sort of idea that this is supposed to express a certain value system, right? And the value system is artful, crafty, complex fencing, publicly displayed. You're putting your body at risk. People die in fechtschule, right? It's just as much of a risk at a fechtschule as it is in a duel, right? So we have actually a record of, in Augsburg in 1591, there's this poor journeyman printer who gets killed. They never actually write down his name. He just says the journeyman printer, right, who gets killed in fechtschule. And they arrest the guy who did it, and they interrogate him for like hours. And they're like, how come you meant to kill him, man? What's the problem that you had with him? And he keeps saying, like, I had no problem with him. I had no beef with him. I behaved according to the rules of the fechtschule, right? And eventually, this is like the lawyers, right, who are writing all this stuff down. And they say that, well, the journeyman printer, it seems like this guy's telling the truth, and he behaved according to the rules of the fechtschule, and the journeyman printer probably wouldn't have died if he wasn't such a heavy bleeder anyway, right? So, like, but what would have happened if that journeyman printer died because my first action in the fechtschule was to thrust, right? Or to come in and I thrust him in the belly because I thought it'd be funny, and actually punch through his gut. I murdered him. There's no question. I'm a murderer. Even though it happened in a fechtschule and everybody, more or less, by showing up, they kind of signed the waiver, right? Saying that they know that they're putting themselves at risk. If I do something that breaks the rules, hoping that it's going to get me an opening that I can exploit, and I end up killing the guy, I murdered him. There's no question about it. And everybody saw it, right? And everybody knows that what I did is against the rules. So there's this kind of acceptance that you're going to do some things that are against the rules, like wailing on a guy's elbow if he keeps his arm under his head. But we only do that because he puts his arms over his head so he can't get hit in the head, right? Because the whole point of a fechtschule is to score, right, the highest bleeding wound against your opponent. So ideally, right, a nice Scheitelhau or a Schielhau right to the top of the skull, eventually the blood trickles down. You win and get 2 golden and get to stay in the ring. He has to go to the barber and he's done, right? And you do that until there's no more fencers left. But we even have indications that it was kind of viewed as kind of, not necessarily negative, but people would kind of sit there and cross their arms and be like, that guy's won 5 or 6 fights already. How much gold does he want? Is that what he came here for? To win gold, right? And so there's kind of this social pressure that you show up and you do 3 or 4 good matches. Whether if you lose, obviously you go out, but if you keep winning, you're eventually going to bow out of the way because you want other people to fence. Because it's not about you. It's about giving everybody the opportunity to show off how good a fencer they are. Because how good a fencer you are is directly related to how good a citizen you are. How good a citizen you are reflects how good a soldier you are. How good a soldier you are reflects back again to how good a man you are, right? It's all sort of tied into this idea of masculinity. And masculinity being on display, right? And we can think about this in dozens of different ways. Like, think about just the clothing that they're wearing, right? These cod pieces that are like this big, right? They don't do that just because it's funny, right? We kind of look at it as being really goofy, but if you tie it into this idea that you are literally swaggering, because that's what is sort of assumed about masculinity and about being a man in a public space, that you're supposed to behave in certain ways, that we all know, they're sort of unspoken, but they're definitely rules, right? So, sort of the structure of these is that some of them would be massive, like massive. You have the parades and like the sword dances we were talking about in Roger's presentation the other day, having these huge parades and everything going through the city. We have some records of like, when the guilds would sponsor these things and have this sort of multi-regional fechtschule that was happening on like a Saint's Day or something like that. You'd have like the Butcher's Guild and they'd make like a massive sausage that it would take like 6 guys on their shoulders to swagger through the city holding this massive sausage on them. And then like the Cheese Makers Guild would have a wheel of cheese that could only fit in a wagon, and they'd bring that to the fechtschule too. And then they'd have like the ale making guilds and everything would have huge wagons just full of beer they'd giving away to citizens as they're going down. And there was absolutely magic, like Super Bowl level public festivals. And then there were other ones where it was like your dad found a fechtmeister in town and then got a few of your little 7-year-old buddies around and had a fechtschule at home, right? So like grandfather, the Stephen Carl Behem guy I talked about earlier, threw a fechtschule for his 7-year-old son Georg. And little Georg actually described the outfit that he had, right? And he was a little like Pluderhosen and a little doublet and everything. It's like a 7-year-old kid. And he talked about how he fenced well enough to earn a laurel, right? And so what does that mean? And so when we start looking at what it actually means to win a fechtschule, right? And so like, if you've been to the Madtown fechtschule, we have winners, right? There's first, second, third place or whatever. Mostly because that was meant to conform to the Midwest Historical Fencing League's provisions for having winners that we could put in, you know, that kind of thing. When you go to a fechtschule at this time, right? Nate and I go up and fence and Nate wins. I go and stitch myself up in the barber, he wins 2 gold, and I have to sit there and pout the rest of the day, right? And then Nate fights the next guy and the next guy and the next guy, and he wins, and he bows out, whatever. He wins like 8 gold. Cool. But maybe I put in a really, really good display when I went and I lost. Maybe I fenced really well and everybody remembered that, right? I could travel from 3 cities away, show up at a fechtschule, lose in my first bout, and still go home with a laurel because I put on a good show. Because I demonstrated that, again, I'm willing to put myself at personal harm to demonstrate how good a fencer I am. And how good a fencer I am doesn't necessarily mean that I win. It means that I behave in a way that everybody expects and everybody honors, right? So what you're doing when you're going to this fechtschule is honoring the art. And you don't honor the art by winning. You honor the art by fencing well, right? And that's a huge difference. And so we can go to tournaments nowadays, right? And we can see people who are fencing because they want to be better fencers. And they're fencing because they see some value in the art in its own sake. And then we can go to tournaments and we see guys who want to win. And all of us can instantly recognize the difference. I guarantee you we can go to a tournament all together and we could all write down like names of people we think are really good fencers and names of people we think are just there to win. And we probably all more or less agree on all of them, right? And we can have different values about that, right? And there's certain value nowadays in playing the game the way the game's structured and sort of not cheating, but if there's certain rules, like why am I not going to take advantage of doing a certain technique over and over and over just to win, right? Because that's the point. Well, the point here is that winning isn't the point. Displaying yourself well is the point. And it's true of dueling, right? Because remember, dueling is public. You're doing it for an audience. You're in front of an audience the whole time. You don't really start seeing private dueling until the late 18th century because they start cracking down on duels. So they don't stop them. They just like go over the town line into New Jersey. They can shoot at each other there where it's not technically illegal. And then they can come back to New York and say, I don't know what happened to Alexander Hamilton. He fell on a bullet, right? But that's not happening in the 16th century. It's happening right now, right? And they don't have these sort of complex ways of you get your second involved, and the second sort of negotiates where and when it's going to happen, and you do it kind of away from public eyes. It's like, we get into a fight now, and we go out in the street now, and we take care of it. And that's what's going on. It's similar in a lot of respects to what's going on at the fechtschule, which is not to say that dueling, that you go in and have a bout in a fechtschule that you are dueling. And they actually have rules against people who have beef, right? If you know that I have beef with Rob because we've been arguing over this stupid nuanced point all weekend, and they know that he and I have beef, and there's any possibility that the two of us might actually try to hurt each other, we can't fight. It doesn't mean we don't, but it means that we're not allowed to or heavily discouraged from, right? Because it's supposed to be peaceful, and it's supposed to just give yourself a safer way of demonstrating your skill with a sword, because the skill with a sword translates into all sorts of other ideas about who we are as men, right? Couple of other things, right? We have like Frye Factor sometime hosted them. So Meyer, right? We have records of him petitioning the Strasbourg City Council to hold fechtschule several times, identified as a Frye Factor. Sometimes that meant the Marksbrüder were not allowed to come. Other times it meant you could come, right? And so the journeyman printer who died in Augsburg in 1591, there's a sad little footnote at the end of the story, right? It's like it's an extra pity that this guy died, because this was the first fechtschule they allowed in Augsburg for like 2 years because the last couple had been so violent, right? And so like finally they're like, okay, fine, you can have a fechtschule, and they show up and instantly some dude dies, and he dies because he's just a heavy bleeder, right? Like, come on, right? So one of the reasons that they sort of prevented this is because there's like active beef going on with these two groups, right? You've got the Frye Factors who are like these kind of like plucky underdogs who are like, no man, we don't want to join the guild, we just want fencing to be free, man. And then you got the Marksbrüder who are like, these guys, right, you should really join the guild. Like, no wonder people are getting hurt. You're not doing it right. So they sometimes also shared spaces, and like these massive public festivals, you probably couldn't tell the marksman not to show up, because they would show up just to probably smash the place up, right? And you don't want to take that risk either. Very often they barred students from coming to fechtschule for a number of different reasons, most of which involves, I think Roger mentioned it earlier, like students fall under different legal codes in certain cities, right? Most of the time university law also said students couldn't be armed, and yet they were almost all the time anyway. So they show up and kind of cause trouble, and then you have to worry not only about like people possibly getting killed because of misbehavior, because these guys don't exist within the same culture, right? All of this is sort of this cultural understanding is conducive on all of us understanding the rules, and that's hard to do, right? We can all have a fechtschule that will look totally different than if we did it at like Long Point, or if we went to Swordfish and tried to hold a fechtschule there. It'd be very different because not everybody is in the same headspace. Whereas, you know, if we throw our own little private one, everybody's more or less going to be on the same page. It's going to be very, very different than if we invited, you know, the nearby Bohurt guys to come in. So this is a kind of it's a much more complicated thing than we tend to think of, right? So this is absolutely earnest fencing. It's not meant to be lethal, but then again, duels also weren't meant to be lethal necessarily. But we also have the possibility of being killed, which is not the point, but it's still a possibility. And it happened often enough that certain towns banned fechtschule from happening for years at a time. So this kind of complicates our idea of this kind of neat demarcation between the earnest fight and the playful fight, right? This sort of Schimpfechten or school defense versus Ernstfechten versus, you know, whatever the terms we want to use, because the lines are meant to be blurred. Because your behavior as a man is something that doesn't ever stop, right? Even when you go home, you're meant to be a husband in a certain way. You're meant to be a father in a certain way, or a son in a certain way, and behave in certain ways, even in the home, privately, in a way that nobody else will ever know. But as soon as you step out onto the street, you are on display all the time. And that reflects not only on you, but also your family. It reflects on your guild. It reflects on the city. It reflects on everything, right? And so if you go and misbehave at a fechtschule, you can be kicked out of your guild. You know, regardless of whether or not they think that you're at fault legally, they can say, like, that's not behavior that we want to have in, you know, the Cobbler's Guild. You're out.
You smash this other craftsman's hands.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and so every single time that you're swinging that sword, you're taking a risk. You know, so you have to absolutely be controlled. You have to make sure that what you're doing is you are in control of that up until the moment it hits. And then when you hit, you only hit hard enough to break the skin and no more. Because people, they didn't know what concussions necessarily were. They knew where they were bad. You know, you have descriptions of people who are concussed, and we can tell based on the description that that dude is concussed. And they knew that was bad. They didn't know exactly what caused it and everything. Well, they knew what caused it. It was hitting him in the head with a sword. Right?
They didn't know why sometimes he doesn't have a sword and sometimes he doesn't.
Right. Right. So all this stuff is very, very tightly controlled by the culture itself. The rules are just up there to kind of tack them on and remind everybody, remember, no thrusting, no hitting with the pommel, no blah, 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 right? But everybody already knew those. This is just to make sure that everybody knows it's right there, just in case you need to be reminded, right? Because your behavior is going to ultimately affect everything. Everything, right? Up to and including whether or not you're allowed to ever throw a fechtschule again, which we want. We want to be able to do. You have a question, Shane?
Did you have to pay reparations if you caused a loss of income to somebody else or another guild?
It depends. That would probably be
legal.
Yeah, that'd just be a decision that was made based on if there was a court case or something like that about it. But yeah, that could totally depend. Yeah.
One of the pet things I've been trying to research goes on even to like, we know the lion's share of the fight is at the Handworks Range, where
Right.
you're displaying the coolest stuff that people can see.
Right.
What does hang out and lingering in like Garage Versetzen do?
Yeah.
That is, I'm closing a line and it threatens the thrust.
Right.
I'm wondering. I haven't found anybody
Yeah.
who hangs out in that posture in any of the images, and it would make sense that if you're going to sit there and threaten the thrust when you know I'm coming in.
Right.
I think that's might be a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think.
I'm looking.
Yeah, I think that we can infer quite a lot from what, especially Meyer's longsword section teaches, and I think we can infer pretty heavily that it was meant to facilitate certain behaviors in fechtschule, or at least in this style of fencing where the thrust is viewed, even in earnest cases, as an indication of your intent, right? That if I use the thrust, my intent is probably to kill the guy, you know, or it's, you know, but then there are things in Meyer that, you know, jab in the chest, right? And what's the difference between a jab and a thrust? Is, well, one of them you call a jab.
The jab is, I placed it on there. I placed it on
Right, yeah. But you have to be really careful about that because, you know, like watching from outside, if I know that technique, I might be able to recognize it. But if I don't, it just looks like you thrust the guy in the chest, right? So you're risking things if you're behaving in a way that is sort of counter to the ideals of the culture, right? Ben.
So what were the long swords they were using in the fecht school building like? Were they kind of like our fetters with kind of the rounded tips and wide edges, or how sharp were they?
I mean, they would have looked pretty much like the ones in Meyer.
Because if they're rounded tips, I could see like, you know, jabbing with the chest is not too dangerous, there's the face, the eyes.
Right, but what if you miss?
What
if you're aiming here and you end up hitting here?
That's a museum replica.
Yeah. Yeah. Those ones there. Yeah.
Just look between the ribs. That could be damaged.
Right. So the thrust is something that's like, Meyer mentions that it's no longer done among the Germans, right? It's not necessarily like illegal, but again, if I'm in a duel and I go out into the street and the very first thing I do is try to thrust a guy, it's pretty clear to everybody watching that my intent is to murder the dude, right? And maybe I set this whole thing up, you know? Maybe I accused you of cheating cards not because I thought you were cheating, it was because I wanted to lure you out into the street so I could kill you and get away with it because it's viewed as legitimate, right? Yeah.
Quick question on the dueling. So obviously those weren't blunted fetters; those were your swords that you were wearing or had at home. But those were supposed to be fair. So would the weapons have to be like comparable size or structure, or would it be considered fair if one dude had a long sword, the other dude had like a dirk or some kind of short blade?
Well, typically you'd have whatever you had on you, if you had it on you at the time, and it'd probably be more of like your everyday carry sword, right? So like when I mentioned earlier, like the three weapons that they taught in the Frye Factor tradition were like pole arms, longsword, and a sword in one hand of some kind, right? By the 1550s, by basically Paulus Hectormeyer, by the 1540s, it's rapier. You're probably carrying a rapier on you all the time. There were also Dussacs and other sort of curved swords and messers and things they'd call something else. Sometimes the difference between what is called or grouped together with like a Dussac looks exactly like a rapier, and they had other words like Raufdagen that they used for the same thing, and like.
But they were comparable.
But it was basically probably a sword in one hand you'd be carrying at your waist on a daily carry. You're generally not going to carry a long sword on you by probably the 1540s or 50s anymore. Cool. That said, sometimes you wouldn't carry one, and sometimes you'd have to go home to get your sword. So I very seriously, like if you and I had an altercation and you had a long sword on you and I only had my dagger, that wouldn't be a duel. That'd be butchery, right?
Right.
And so if I'm accepting the duel, it's my job to make sure I have a sword that's comparable. And that might just be like, hey, Nate, can I borrow your longsword?
Yeah.
Right? And then he'd lend me his longsword. And that might mean going home and getting my own. Right?
Cool.
And maybe by the time I go home to get my sword, you've cooled off and we decide we're going to call the whole thing off. You know?
Yeah.
Maybe. But they were meant to be fair, and if it was unfair, it wasn't a duel.
Cool.
Yeah. So to kind of conclude some of this, we've already sort of gone over a little bit. Now, I'll get to this guy in a minute. Right? Because I love that guy. But anyway, we have this very complicated sort of spectrum of urban violence at the time, right? And obviously I didn't talk about warfare, and I didn't talk about feuding necessarily. I didn't talk about like raiding or anything else like that are also sort of patterned in ritual ideas of violence. But public violence like this followed very predictable patterns and very known patterns, right? So like if we're all sitting in a tavern and we start seeing two people exchange heated words, we all know where this is going. And to an extent, we have the responsibility to cool that off and make sure it doesn't happen. But at the same time, if it gets to a point where it's untenable, we have the responsibility to back off and let them handle it, right? And this is massively more complicated than we tend to think about, duels, right? And even when we look at earlier judicial dueling, they still have these very complicated rituals, and they have all these sort of artificialities about them too. You've got two guys in armor, and they're supposed to go through like three hits with a lance, 3 hits with a polearm on foot, 3 exchanges with the sword on foot, and then you go to daggers. And the sort of implication of all that is that you're not really expecting anybody to die, at least up until they get to daggers, right? Because you're going through the motions. And the point of this whole thing is to demonstrate, again, your willingness to risk your life in order to prove a point of honor, right? So men were expected to respond to things. You know, if you couldn't just sit there and take an insult, like, you know, even we have records of duels that started because some dude made a joke and another guy overheard it and said, you can't let somebody say that, right? And it might be like me and James, who get on each other's case all the time, and like he says something that we know isn't necessarily meant to be insulting, but you don't know that. And then you go back and you tell everybody else in Michigan, like, hey dude, this guy insulted Adam and he didn't respond. And what does that mean, right?
Adam's a coward.
Yeah. And it could be everyone in the room wants to avoid somebody dying. But because of the sort of cultural inertia about these ideas of honor and sort of property and self-defense and all this, like, it might lead to people killing each other who don't want to. And we have stories about duels all the time that involve dudes like brothers are getting into duels, and they're both desperate to avoid it, but they can't because they're trapped by the culture, right? And this is like a big thing of a lot of like early novels that men write mostly. Women don't really care about that. But a lot of early novels actually, like, you know, the stories about these tragedies of duels, because it's just this sort of blind cultural inertia that leads men to fight for stupid reasons, right? Violence also served a lot of cultural and personal functions, as well as you know, kind of to everything it means in sort of a wider sense. It also means something personally, and your ability to inflict or defend against violence is really important to your standing as a person. And that, again, it could even affect something as banal as your job. And lastly, kind of the fechtschule and tie all this into having an ability to show that off in a way that is sort of like, almost like a cultural pressure valve, right? You're going to fight. If you're an armed man, you're probably going to get into a fight at some point in your life, because of all these things we've talked about already. The fechtschule gives you a place to show this off in a way that probably won't lead to a riot, which will then lead to, you know, burning down the Jewish quarter of the city, hopefully, or going and dragging out the Protestants into the street, and that kind of thing, probably. And so, but I think, again, it blurs this line between the idea that we have of sort of the meaning of violence, this idea that we have this very strict demarcation between violence that might kill a guy and violence that's meant to be sporty, something like that, right? There's not a very clear distinction. And so lastly, I mostly just really, really like this guy. So I used a couple of woodcuts from the same dude. His name's Franti, and this is from 1559. And I mostly like this guy because he's got, like, there's 4 beards in this picture. Right? Like, look at that. He's obviously got a huge beard. He's got a beard on his sword. He's got another beard up here, you can see, the crossguard. And then he's got a beard on his hat. And mostly I just like that. And it looks like he's bestowing knowledge upon us, right? And he looks like the kind of guy we should listen to.
I agree. I agree.
So when we're kind of thinking about going into the fechtschule, which we're going to do now in 5 or 6 minutes, right, is if our guild is here to sort of try to reconstruct this kind of fencing, we should also have in mind trying to reconstruct the values that they had as fencers, right? And we have to kind of decouple our sort of modern assumptions about sport and competition and what value that brings us, and start trying to think about it in terms of how they approached it, right? And how they approached it is very, very clear. It's constant. You see it all the time when you're reading about fechtschule, is that it doesn't matter who wins. It's nice if you win some gold, but it doesn't matter who wins. What matters is your behavior, even if you lose, right? So there might be certain things that we do that we think are more effective, or I'm not going to do this thing for Meyer because it doesn't work, right? Or, you know, it's not worth it to, like, I just want to go out and win as many bouts as possible. And like, we can all kind of, that's not what the culture's about, right? The culture's about even giving your opponent the opportunity to defend as well as he possibly can. And I think that's a really important way that we can approach, even so as members of the Frye Factor Guild, right? And especially as people in the Frye Factor Guild who have a red ribbon that they wear at tournaments. We can think about this if we go to Icebreaker. We can think about this as we go to the Chicago tournament. We can think about this if we go to Swordfish, right? is that we are not only representing ourselves as fencers, we're representing the Meyer Frye Factor Guild. You're representing your local club. And you want to be the kind of, well, I think, right? I want to be the kind of fencer that people want to fence because I'm good at fencing. You know, not because I'm winning, not because they want to beat me up, but because they want to have the experience of fencing me, because hopefully it should be interesting and it should be fun and it should be challenging. And those are the kind of fencers that I seek out. Those are the kind of fencers that I want to come to events like this and spend hours fencing, right? Those are the kind of people I go to WMAW to hang out with and talk with. And those are the kind of people that I want to spend time with. Not necessarily the guys who win the gold medals, right? And so that's the kind of thing that I want to think about. And if there's any sort of like agenda that I'm pushing by talking about the fechtschule, it's kind of getting into that sort of 16th century headspace where the goal is the fencing, right? It's not, winning isn't the reason we fence to fence, right? And I think that's really important, and I think that has recharacterized the way that I approach reading Meyer and fencing when I do, right?
So it's a flashy display of complicated handworks.
Yeah, that's one way to characterize it.
At a non-running in sort of way.
Yeah.
And it's not Joco Largo either. It's not. I'm not
Right.
really far away, just throwing a snipe.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit more about sort of expectations and behaviors in the fechtschule that we're going to do in 5 minutes downstairs, because I know there's a few new people that haven't done it yet. But any last?